Good morning. I'm calling this lesson today from Romans 4. Abraham started it. We talked last time about what marvelous effects the book of Romans has had through the history of Christian thought, and we're going to explore some of those ideas more today. In the world of social science, when we study ancient people, we virtually always find that religion was there. It took lots of different forms, sometimes even to the point of being savage and murderous. But always people wondered, what is the unseen world like? And, more importantly, how do I make arrangements to be in good standing with that other world? Often, we think that the religious impulse was the result of trouble. Cataclysmic events, floods, tornadoes, death, illness, etc., so that we may be not in good standing with that other world and need to take steps to straighten that out. So all of that went on, and now here we are with Paul in Romans to deal with questions about that, this universal quest for knowledge of God. There are some things that are sort of true about us as we think and feel what we do religiously. These are things that I've been told and heard and seen over many years in my work and my personal relationships. I'd like to start with myself from when I was a boy. I had a list in my mind of people who were okay and likely to be saved as opposed to those who were not. On the good list was my grandma. She was just the it, and there weren't no itter, and I've talked about her in lessons in this church. But God could reach her okay, no problem. My minister, who at that time happened to be Virgil Trout, the famous preacher for years in the Church of Christ, he's now dead, and others, but that didn't include me. That as God reached down to do what he was going to do for people, he couldn't quite reach me, and so I had the feeling, very distinctly so, that things were not okay with me and that I was not going to be in the elite of the religious because I wasn't getting it right. I'd like to know how many people have told me that over the years of my work. The other side of that is when people are close to death, or perhaps at death, they've said, have I done enough to merit salvation? That grandma of mine that I love so much was a snuff dipper. And when we would talk seriously about things, she would say to me, do you think I'll go to torment for dipping snuff? I said, no, Grandma, I don't think so. As though I knew something that she didn't know. Have I done enough? Those questions plague us and bother us. And the book of Romans has wonderful answers for that, and I want to do some of those today. When I started studying Romans seriously years ago, I did a kind of an outline for myself, and I copied this from somebody. It wasn't my original idea. Chapter 1, Paul says the Gentiles have made a horrible mess of things. Their behavior's been awful, and they've misthought about things. So the Gentiles got it all wrong. Chapter 2, Well, the Jews are better off because they've got the law and got knowledge and got direct revelation of God, but they didn't get it right either. All the while they were saying to the Gentiles, you're getting it wrong. They were doing the same stuff. So the Jews got it wrong too. And then chapter 3, everybody got it wrong. All have sinned and do in fact fall short of the glory of God. And there's a remedy for that, thank heavens. And the remedy is the grace of God and man's faith response to that grace. That's the remedy. So we're going to spend the rest of the book dealing with that and the ramifications that come from that. The righteous shall live by faith, as we've said, is the theme of Romans. And we said that the word faith has lots of different meanings in the Bible, all of them dependent on what the speaker or writer means by the word at that moment. Sometimes the word faith is a doctrine. Sometimes it's a set of beliefs that you adhere to. Sometimes it's a challenge, and Paul said, I kept the faith. And various other meanings. I like to say that in Romans, Paul means 4 things when he talks about faith. This is Paul on faith in Romans. Mental assent, which we talked about last time, trust, commitment, and obedience. Today I want us to work in the direction of putting all of those together as to what they mean. And to do that, we'll be doing biblical characters, particularly Abraham and David. It's primarily about Abraham today, but David is going to be entering into the. Good night. That plane sounds like it's going to land in our yard. Good night. There are lots of characters about the ancient Hebrews. They're important, but I believe it's safe to say that David, Abraham, and Moses are the 3 main ones, more important than the others. And we're always surprised that the writer, talking about them and their particular history, shows them in their real humanity, warts and all. We find that they all did stuff they shouldn't have done and had major flaws. And that kind of confuses us sometimes, because how could they be thought of as God's special people given all that? Well, all of that depends on God's definition and not ours. Nevertheless, that's how they're presented to us, and so that's how we'll be studying them. I'd like to read today's assignment, Romans 4, 1 through 12. What then shall we say about Abraham our forefather according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now to one who works, his wages are not reckoned as a gift, but as his due. And to one who does not work, but trusts him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is reckoned as righteousness. So also David pronounces a blessing upon the man to whom God reckons righteousness apart from works. Blessed are those whose iniquities are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord will not reckon his sin. Is this blessing pronounced only upon the circumcised, or also upon the uncircumcised? We say that faith was reckoned to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it reckoned to him? Was it before or after he had been circumcised? It was not after, but before he was circumcised. He received circumcision as a sign or seal of the righteousness which he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised, and who thus have righteousness reckoned to them, and likewise the father of the circumcised, who are not merely circumcised, but also follow the example of the faith which our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. Circumcision, of course, being the physical sign that one was a person of faith, that they were marked as belonging to God and being of special standing. Let's take just a couple of minutes to do notes from this text so that we are grounded in where we're headed and what we're doing. Excuse me. First, Abraham is pioneer. As I said in the beginning, in the title, he was the beginner. He was the one who started all this. When you study Genesis, the first 11 chapters are the unusual, heroic stuff about the beginning of things. But the real beginning of history, as we think about it and study it, starts with chapter 12. That, of course, is Abraham. So all of this business of faith begins with him. In Paul's words, his faith was reckoned, quote unquote, as righteousness. The point is that it was not what he did. He was not somebody who was keeping all the rules and therefore deserved salvation. That was not the essence of faith. It was that he was declared to be faithful. I wanted to do a little example of that business of reckoned, or in the world that Judy and I live in, we like the word attributed. This is a piece of the blue and white stuff that we collect. One of the first pieces we bought when we started. On the back, their name is not there. They didn't name this piece. But there's a certain color to it, a certain shape. The whiteness is a certain way. And on the back is a little mark put there by the person who made the piece. And because of all these things, we say that this piece is a Spode piece. Spode being the famous factory in the UK, one of our very favorites, and sadly now bankrupt and dismantled because of bad handling of debt. We attribute to that piece that's probably Spode. Not everybody would agree about that, but that's what we think. So this business of reckon, meaning that's declared, it is so said about you, is designated. Abraham is called righteous, considered to be righteous by God. David joins into the business. In his psalm, he wrote that the man whose sin is not reckoned to him, but who is attributed to be righteous, is blessed. Well, we know about David, he was kind of a mess. If you're studying family and national life and all that, you can just about say about David that he did everything that could be done wrong. That deal with Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite, that's almost so bad you can't stand to hear the story. Here's this faithful guy was his servant, and he impregnates his wife and has him murdered. And it's almost, you said, what just a minute, I can't stand that story. That's just so awful. But he was considered a man after God's own heart. He was reckoned as righteous by God. Now, we went through the reading a while ago, excuse me, about Paul's faith, or about Abraham's faith, that his faith was previous to his being circumcised. He had the sign later on, but his faith came before that. It wasn't dependent on circumcision, which means that at that moment faith is considered as a freestanding entity, which he had as a gift before he was circumcised. This part of Romans has what for me, as a boy coming out of that time where I had the list of those who could be saved and those who couldn't, a big surprise. And I've sometimes wondered to myself if just ordinary folk, when they read this, A, do they understand it? And B, do they believe it? So I'm going to do two main points about this text today, which will lead on into later texts. And the first one is the surprising revelation that God is on our side. God is on our side. God likes us. He has good intentions toward us. He's gone to great trouble to see that we were the beneficiaries of his good favor. Back to the ancient world, because of cataclysms and horrible things going on, people concluded that the gods, whoever they were, excuse me, and whatever they were like, were a threat. They were dangerous. They were perilous. You didn't cross the gods. You didn't do things that were against their best interest, against their will, because if you did, awful things would happen to you. But the whole message of Romans is that God is on our side. People have talked to me a lot over the years, sometimes expressing a belief that things are set up against them. That sometimes they call it fate, put various names to it, but that they are not in a relative position about life that's favorable, that the odds are stacked against them. I have a good friend who is an attorney that told me he was in a case and he had the feeling that things had already been decided in a back room somewhere without consideration of the evidence. And so he said to the judge and the other attorneys, look, it seems to me that this case may be wired, and I'm going to take great pains to find out. And if it is, there's going to be some consequences. I don't remember the rest of that story, how that worked out. But we have the feeling sometimes that things are set up against us, that other people are against us, or fate, or whatever term we want to use. Talk some about my folks, particularly about my dad. He was a very competitive person and socialized us that way, so that I grew up being a very competitive person. Now, one thing that you usually know about folk like me is that we wonder if things have been stacked against us. I've done a lot of kidding with many of you about my pet peeve from 1948 until this good day, that the OU football team goes to Dallas every year and plays the Texas University football team in the Cotton Bowl in Dallas. I hate that. I hated it in 1948. I hate it now. I believe that's unfair and sets the odds in the wrong direction because that's in Texas. My patter about that, the big joke is that I hate Texas so bad I haven't looked south in 10 years. The fact is I've lived in Texas several times. I admire and respect Texas and Texans. I love how the thinking goes on. But I've had the feeling that that football game is not fair because when you're playing in somebody else's area, you tend to lose. All the statistics show that, and being competitive, that's how I felt about that. Now, let me very quickly say, I recognize that that kind of competition is a personality quirk. That's not good mental health. A lot of you have heard me tell this story. Probably the worst thing I ever did as far as my marriage is concerned was a party of a quail gathering at Christmas time one year. Everybody wanted to play dominoes, and they baited me into doing it. I grew up being very competitive about that and following rules and I acted really bad at that game that night. I asked my preacher the next day if I needed to go forward at church, and he said, no, it wasn't that bad. Judy just screeched and hollered when we got home because I was so crazy. What I had done was to define a love situation as war and behaved accordingly. That is by definition a psychosis when you miss reality that badly. That competitive thing of the world is going to cheat me, things are not going the way I want them to, competitive about everything. So I quit playing dominoes. Haven't done it in years, don't intend to ever do it again. Let me refer to that just briefly back to the college time. When I was in college at Bartlesville, a Central Christian College, one of the things that we did was play Moon, which is a bidding game, sort of similar to bridge and other things like that, though much simpler. Excuse me.
While you're stopped, I'll clarify and say that I screeched in a loving way, sort of.
Yes, loving. This fellow and I had a reputation as being competitive and having a certain skill at playing that game. We had several students in school who didn't live on the campus out in the mansion where we lived, but lived in town and drove from Bartlesville out. And this one fellow told me that he had heard that we were Moon players. Yeah, we are. Well, I'm sorry you guys don't get to play with serious people. Oh, yeah? Well, why don't you come out sometime and bring your partner and let's play? He said, well, we will do that. We'll come out and... Well, he didn't exactly say this. He just inferred that we'll teach you how to do it. So they came out and we spent all night playing Moon. And I need to tell you the memory that he probably doesn't remember and I do. My partner and I beat them 83 games. So, you understand, I recognize that this is a personality problem, except when you're in a situation where competitiveness is what is called for. And in that case, it's a great virtue. But it seems to us that the world is often against us. Things just aren't fair, and we're not getting a good shake. But then I want to tell the other side of that story. How many stories have I told in class? Dozens. About being a student, high school, college, graduate school, eventually to the level of PhD. When you go to graduate school and take a PhD or equivalent to it, it's kind of a semi-competitive arrangement, and sometimes it seems like things are stacked against you, and there are mythical stories about crazy professors who block people from getting their degree, people who work and still never get a degree, and they're almost so awful you can't stand to hear them. Well, I went through that same thing, and there were times when I really seriously wondered, am I going to be able to make this happen? And I suppose that since there were lots of people that it didn't happen to, that's certainly a real consideration. But during the time that we call the oral defense, I had taken the exams, met with the whole faculty for them to quiz me about my exams and to decide if I was going to be allowed to continue to the end. Kind of a scary time. As that process was going on, I suddenly had the realization these guys intend for me to get a degree. I was able to sort of take a deep breath and relax because I thought I really could tell that. It turned out that I was right about that. That these people were not against me, they were for me. They were doing everything they could to make arrangements for me to have a PhD degree. I remember the deep sense of gratitude that I felt because of that. And from that point on to the end, it was just a matter of doing what work was necessary because I was not to be ambushed or double-crossed, but be allowed to get the degree. God, in Pauline thought and language, is on our side. For us, He intends for good things to happen to us and for us to experience His salvation. When I've talked to people about that, tried to put in my words those facts in a way that they would get it and apply it to themselves, they've often said something like this: yes, I know about the grace of God, but you just don't know how bad I am. And you don't know what I'm bad about. I've got things about me that just won't do, and you don't know those. Well, yes, I do. That is exactly what I was thinking about myself in those last years when I thought that God couldn't quite reach me, that there was something fundamentally wrong about me that disqualified me. No. There is no limit to the reach of God's grace. And let me go ahead and say about that business of not knowing how bad somebody is and what they're bad about. Yeah, after a while, you've heard all the stories. There are new wrinkles to it, but whatever it is, God is on our side. So, that raises a second question. If we're righteous because God says we're righteous, it's attributed to us instead of our possessing it in and of ourselves. Does that mean that it doesn't matter what we do? The charge that was brought against Paul, it was brought against Augustine, it was brought against Martin Luther and Karl Barth and K.C. Moser and everybody that I've known about historically or personally who emphasized God's attribution or reckoning of grace in Pauline language. The charge was and is cheap grace. So what that means is that you can just do anything and it's okay. there's something in us that kind of objects to that. This feeling of, look, people should not get away with doing the wrong thing. Back to that competitive business for a second. We have this myth that we say where cheaters never win. I've put that to the test before, and that's wrong. Cheaters nearly always win. But they shouldn't. You ought to play fair. You ought to go with the rules. And if you're doing things that are opposed to the way God is, you shouldn't get by with that. That should not just be, well, that's okay. Just don't worry about that. It'll be all right. I need to be a plot spoiler for a minute. Not during my segments that are assigned to me in Romans, but in later lessons. Paul is going to deal with that question. Does it matter what we do? And he's going to say in his own language, it matters very much. You could reach this conclusion that because grace and attribution reaches out to you and says, I count you as being good, even though that's not what you actually are, but in my sight you are. We could say that, well, say what we ought to do, get serious about doing wrong. If the more we mess up, the better, more grace we get. Well, let's have a go at it. Let's take full advantage of that. J.B. Phillips, in translating Paul's answer to that, he says, what a ghastly thought. To Paul, it matters greatly what you do. It is simply that what you do is not to cause God to owe you his favor, but rather when you do good, it's because you can't help yourself. Because when you receive grace through faith, and God says, I count you as being righteous, then that's a situation that actually happens. Paul is big on good behavior. In one place it says we're created for good works. I'd like to put it like this. Grace, attribution of righteousness, is a powerful energy source and motivational factor in creating good works. That when you are aware of what God has done for you and is doing for you, you are impelled to copy that, to do good things. And so I'd like to put it like this. Attributed justification leads to, in real time, personal righteousness. It is possible, in fact, it is obligatory, for us to be righteous as a result of having received God's grace. That's where we're pushed, that's how we understand things, and that's what we're to be. Having spent my whole adult life in church work, so to speak, of one kind and another, and knowing personally thousands of people who are interested in being people of faith and who try very hard at that, I think that I could, if I could hold up long enough physically to do it, that I could tell stories for 24 hours of people being righteous. They would be about money, about work, about assistance. I obviously would get too tired to continue, but if I may, I'd like to complete my lesson today by just telling one of my favorite stories about that. I'm pretty sure that I have told this story in class, so if you've heard it, well, go ahead and go to sleep. I think this was probably 1962 when this happened. I was a young guy just out of college, the preaching minister for a little church in Central Texas, probably 125 people, all of whom were older and smarter than me, but I was the preacher. On a Sunday morning, about 2 minutes till 10 o'clock, when I was just about to begin teaching the adult Bible class, a young man came hurrying in to where I was and said, "Brother Cail, there is a lady out here with a bunch of kids who needs some help. They're on their way to New Mexico or Arizona and just in terrible trouble and need some help. It's a minute or two till I have to start my Sunday morning work." So I said to this young person, "Go find L.C. Nix and tell him what you told me, and tell him I'll talk to him later and for him to take care of that if he will." L.C. Nix was my closest friend in that town. He had served in World War II in the Navy. He was a mechanic. He was a smart, a good-hearted individual. He's a rough talker, a rough individual, somebody that I admired and respected, who was kind of a mentor to me. And I didn't know what else to do besides call on him because I knew he'd take care of it. So I taught my Bible class and preached the sermon in church, and afterwards started looking for him to see what happened. He was involved and got several other people involved, and each one of them told me various parts of it. This woman had 3 children. She was a single mother, and she's broke, in trouble, and going to New Mexico or Arizona to be with family. And when she got to Itasca, things just kind of ran out. She was out of gas. She had 2 bad tires on the car. She didn't have any money to get food for the kids. She was just desperate. And there she was at the church building. Well, Nick took hold of that. I don't know how many people he got involved besides himself. Took her car to his filling station, put 2 used tires on her to replace her tires that were in terrible shape, filled it up with gas, and they took the kids and her to Bud's Diner downtown. There were 2 places to eat in that town. There was Dorothy's. She was a member of the church there, and her place was closed on Sunday, so you had to go to Bud's. It was a diner. You can imagine what that looked like. Took her and those kids in there and said, "Feed them." It was far enough along in the morning that they had the lunch ready, so they did. One of the little boys ate 2 plate lunches that a grown man who was working in the field would eat 1. This kid was, and then they fixed him a sack of hamburgers and sandwiches to take with them. And I'm pretty sure some cash changed hands. And I wish I could tell you the rest of the story, but I know nothing else about it. That lady went on her way, and that was the end of the story. Those guys did that not to earn any salvation or any credit or any of that. They were all sort of reluctant to reveal what had gone on. Gets me all teared up talking about it. Some of them, as they talked about it, got all teared up. They wished that they could have done more. But I have to say that those guys were behaving righteously. Now you could multiply that by thousands, and all of you could tell stories like that. Some just exactly like that. And you'd be on track. And that fits in with Paul very nicely. That we're created for good works. And when we receive the grace through faith, we are supposed to behave in certain ways, and so we set out to live righteous lives. Not so that God owes us. It's not our wages, but because that He has made us who we are. Well, you can tell that was an important story to me. I've told it more than once, I'm sure, and I probably will tell it again. So there you are. Let's close with a prayer. Lord, we thank you for all that you have done and are doing for us. Bless us to behave as we should as your people. Bless us so that we can be together again very soon. In Jesus' name, amen.